November 23rd, 1978, Murwillumbah, New South Wales, Australia. $1.7 million. Gone, while an entire town slept. And the craziest part? The bank sat 100 meters from the police station, and no one heard a thing. A gang of thieves broke into the 130-year-old Bank of New South Wales. They drilled through the vault door with surgical precision, took every single note inside, and vanished into the Australian night. But this isn't just a story about a bank robbery. It's about the master safecracker they called the Monster, a corrupt police officer who transferred to town 5 months before the heist, and a career criminal who claimed credit for the whole thing from his prison cell. $1.7 million in 1978. That's $10 million today. The biggest cash heist in Australian history. And here's the thing. Over 45 years later, no one has ever been caught. Not a single dollar has ever been found. This is how a gang of thieves pulled off the perfect crime in a sleepy country town and got away with it. The story begins not in Murwillumbah, but in Melbourne, in the criminal underworld of the 1970s. His name was Graham Kinneberg, but everyone called him the Monster. Kinneberg was 52 years old in 1978. A master safecracker with decades of experience, one of the most prolific and influential gangsters in Melbourne at the time. But you wouldn't know it by looking at him. The Monster was a smart criminal. He managed to avoid public attention for decades, stayed in the shadows, never drew heat. His arrest record was surprisingly thin for a man of his stature in the underworld, not because he was innocent, because he was careful. When police asked what he did for a living, Kinneberg always had the same answer. He was a rigger, a simple working man. But this simple working man sent his children to private schools, funded their education without any legitimate income to explain it. How does a rigger afford private school tuition? The Monster had built his entire reputation on one particular skill, one that took years to master: cracking safes. He started young, learned the trade from older criminals in Melbourne's underworld. By his 30s, he could open almost any safe in Australia. By his 40s, he was teaching others. Kinneberg understood something that most criminals didn't. The best heists aren't about violence. They're about patience, planning, precision. He never rushed a job, never took unnecessary risks, and never, ever talked about his work. That last rule was the most important. In the criminal world, silence is survival. Most criminals get caught because someone talks. A girlfriend, a drinking buddy, a cellmate looking for a deal. Kinneberg trusted no one with information they didn't need to know. And it worked. For decades, it worked. In the 1970s, a series of robberies swept through Melbourne and Sydney. Police believed a single gang was behind them all. They called them the Magnetic Drill Gang. The name came from their equipment, 2 specialized tools that made them virtually unstoppable. The first was a circular electromagnet. They would clamp it onto the side of any safe. It held in place a powerful diamond-tipped drill. This drill could bore a hole just above the lock's tumblers in minutes. The second tool was a medical scope, a device designed for surgeons. The gang used it to peer through the drilled hole. They could see the lock's tumblers clearly. Then, using a special attachment, they could move those tumblers from outside the safe. No explosives, no noise, no mess, just precision. The gang had been perfecting their craft for years. They practiced on one brand of safe in particular, Chubb safes, the most popular brand in Australian banks. How did they practice? They stole Chubb safes from previous heists, took them somewhere private, drilled into them over and over until they knew every weakness. By 1978, the Magnetic Drill Gang had already pulled off several major jobs. They took $350,000 from an American Express office in Melbourne, another $250,000 in rings, earrings, diamonds, and gold from a manufacturing jeweler, also in Melbourne. Over $1 million in total. And they were just getting started. But could they pull off something bigger? Could they hit a target worth twice as much as everything they'd stolen before? Police suspected Graham Kinneberg was the organizer, the man who planned every detail. He had been linked to a bullion snatch in Queensland, once charged with receiving stolen property from a burglary at the home of Lindsay Fox, one of Australia's richest men. When police raided Kinneberg's house, they found $4,500 in cash in a drawer, and a rear pendant belonging to Fox's wife in his coat pocket. The monster made the police an offer. Keep the money, just don't charge him with the burglary. That was the kind of man he was, always negotiating, always finding a way out. But even the monster needed a bigger score, something that would set him up for life. What would it take? The Magnetic Drill Gang found their answer in an unlikely place, a quiet country town called Murwillumbah. Why Murwillumbah? Why would anyone travel hundreds of kilometers to rob a small-town bank? The town sits near the border of Queensland and New South Wales. Population around 8,000 in 1978. A sleepy community where nothing much happened. A place where people didn't lock their doors. Where the biggest excitement was the local football match on Saturday afternoons. Surrounded by sugarcane fields and rolling green hills, Murwillumbah felt like the last place on earth where a major crime would happen. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Where strangers stood out. Where the local constable knew most people by name. But the Bank of New South Wales in Murwillumbah had a secret. It was a collection point. Old banknotes from throughout the northeast of New South Wales were sent there, from dozens of smaller branches. The Murwillumbah branch gathered them all, then shipped them to the Reserve Bank. This meant that on certain days, the vault held far more cash than any normal country bank, millions of dollars, sitting in a 130-year-old building, in a town where the biggest crime was probably a parking ticket. The bank itself was unremarkable, a heritage building in the center of town. The local police station sat just 100 meters away, close enough to see the front door. But the thieves weren't interested in the front door. They were interested in the back. The rear of the bank had a wooden door, old, weathered. It led directly to the bank's strong room. From there you could access the main banking hall, and from the main hall you could reach the vault. The vault itself was protected by a Chubb-safe door, the same brand the gang had been practicing on for years. And then there was the timing. On November 22, 1978, a large shipment of cash arrived at the bank, stored in large plastic containers, old notes collected from banks throughout the region, destined for workers' pay packets. $1.7 million in $50 notes, untraceable. Someone knew that shipment was coming. Someone knew exactly when it would arrive, and someone told the gang. Who was the inside man? That question still haunts investigators 45 years later. The gang spent months preparing. According to one account, they had been following an armored truck up and down the coast, watching it, timing it, looking for the perfect place to strike. They considered hitting the truck directly, taking the money on the road, but that plan had problems. Armed robbery meant guns. Guns meant someone could get killed, and killing someone meant murder charges. The bank was cleaner. Break and enter, burglary, much lighter sentences if they got caught, and less chance of anyone getting hurt. A calculated decision, risk versus reward, the smarter play. The gang established a base on the Gold Coast, just across the Queensland border. The area was flooded with tourists year-round. 5 strangers would blend right in. No one would notice them. No one would remember their faces. They watched the bank for weeks, learned the rhythms of the town. When the police changed shifts, when the streets went quiet, when the last lights turned off. Men were spotted outside the bank at around 9:30 p.m. on the night of the robbery. A white Holden panel van was seen nearby. Everything was planned to the smallest detail. Entry points, exit routes, timing, equipment. The vault door would take hours to crack. They knew that, so they planned for a long night. 5 men, each with a specific job, working in silence while the town slept. Now here's a question worth thinking about. 5 men, 1 small town, 1 bank 100 meters from a police station. Would you take that risk for $1.7 million? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. November 23rd, 1978, sometime after midnight. The gang made their move. They approached the back of the bank, the old wooden door, the entrance to the strong room, the weak point in the bank's defenses. They forced it open, quietly. No alarms triggered, no lights came on. 5 men slipped inside. The strong room led to the main banking hall. From there, they could see the vault door, their target, a Chubb safe, the same model they had cracked dozens of times before. They set up their equipment. The electromagnetic clamp went onto the vault door first, then the diamond-tipped drill. The motor hummed softly as it bit into steel. What if someone walking past heard that hum? What if a late-night driver noticed the van parked behind the bank? The drill created a small hole, just above the lock's tumblers, precisely placed. One man inserted the medical scope. Through the tiny hole, he could see the internal mechanism of the lock, the tumblers that stood between them and $1.7 million. Using the special attachment, he began to manipulate the tumblers, one by one, feeling for the right positions, listening for the clicks. This was delicate work. It couldn't be rushed. One wrong move and the entire mechanism could jam. They would have to start over, or worse, abandon the job entirely. The safecracker worked by feel, by sound, by instinct developed over decades of practice. Outside, the town remained silent. Not a car on the streets, not a light in the windows, just darkness and the distant sound of insects. Inside the bank, the only sounds were breathing and the soft clicks of tumblers falling into place. The police station sat 100 meters away. Were there officers on duty? Were they awake? Were they looking toward the bank? While the safecracker worked on the vault, another man had a different job. He was cutting an escape route through the second floor of the bank, a backup exit in case something went wrong. Did they really think of everything? Hours passed. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3. The work was painstaking. Each tumbler had to be moved into exactly the right position. A fraction of a millimeter off, and the lock wouldn't release. The safecracker had done this before, many times, but never with $1.7 million on the other side of the door. Never in a town this small. Never with a police station this close. The streets outside remained silent. The police station showed no signs of activity, no patrols, no flashlights, nothing. But then something must have crossed their minds. What if a patrol car drove by right now? What if a security guard showed up early? They were deep inside the bank, no quick way out. The safecracker continued his work, tumbler by tumbler, click by click. And then, it happened. The last tumbler clicked into place. The vault door swung open. Inside, stacked neatly in large plastic containers, sat $1.7 million in $50 notes, row after row after row. More money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. More money than the entire town of Murwillumbah earned in a year. The gang moved quickly now. They emptied the vault, every note, every container, loaded into bags. But they weren't finished yet. They had one more task. They jammed the vault door shut from the inside, removed the combination lock dials, took the safe handle off the door completely. Why? To buy time. When the bank opened in the morning, staff wouldn't be able to get into the vault. They would have to call a locksmith. That locksmith would have to come from Brisbane, hours away. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the gang would be long gone. They slipped out the back door, left it slightly ajar, loaded their equipment and their money into the white panel van, and vanished into the Australian night. How did 5 men with $1.7 million in cash simply disappear? The most likely answer is the Gold Coast, their base of operations, a tourist haven where strangers didn't attract attention. They probably split up immediately, each man taking his share, each man going a different direction, the classic strategy. If one gets caught, the others stay free. Did they celebrate? Did they count the money in some anonymous motel room? Did they realize they had just pulled off the biggest heist in Australian history? We'll never know, because none of them ever talked. The sun rose over Murwillumbah on November 23, 1978. The townspeople went about their morning routines. Coffee, breakfast, the newspaper. No one knew that the biggest bank heist in Australian history had happened while they slept. At 7:30 a.m., a security guard arrived at the Bank of New South Wales. He walked around to the back of the building. The door was open, just slightly, a few inches ajar. His heart began to pound. He stepped inside. The strong room looked wrong. Things had been moved. He made his way to the main hall, then to the vault. The vault door was closed, but the handle was missing. The combination dials were gone. He tried to open it. Nothing. The door wouldn't budge. It had been sealed from the inside. Something was very wrong. The alarm was raised. Police flooded the streets of Murwillumbah within minutes. The quiet country town had never seen anything like it. Officers everywhere, cordons around the bank, detectives arriving from across the region, patrol cars blocking intersections. The entire town ground to a halt. Word spread fast in a town of 8,000 people. By mid-morning, crowds had gathered outside the bank. Everyone wanted to see what had happened. They called in a Chubb locksmith from Brisbane, a specialist named Smith. He worked on that vault door for 5 hours straight. He couldn't open it. The gang had done their job too well. The door was completely sealed, no way to crack it from the outside. Finally, the police made a decision. If they couldn't go through the door, they would go through the wall. Local council workers were called in. They brought heavy equipment, jackhammers, concrete cutters. They broke through the vault wall itself. When they finally got inside, a bank official surveyed the damage. He spoke 4 words that would echo through Australian criminal history. They got the lot. $1.7 million. Every single note, gone. The investigation began immediately. Detectives examined the crime scene inch by inch. They found the drilled hole in the vault door, the marks from the electromagnetic clamp, the medical scope left behind. The signature of the magnetic drill gang. Forensic experts dusted for fingerprints. They found nothing useful. The gang had worn gloves throughout. They examined the wooden back door. It had been forced open, but carefully. No signs of violent entry, just enough pressure to pop the lock. They photographed the vault wall, where council workers had broken through. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The police had to do more damage to the bank than the criminals did. Detectives began interviewing everyone in the area. Had anyone seen anything unusual? Had anyone heard any noise? Had anyone noticed a white panel van? A few residents recalled seeing men near the bank around 9:30 p.m., but it was dark. They couldn't make out faces. They couldn't provide useful descriptions. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives from Sydney and Brisbane were brought in. This wasn't a local crime anymore. This was the biggest cash theft in Australian history. A $250,000 reward was posted, one of the largest in Australian history at the time. Anyone with information that led to an arrest would be set for life. No one came forward, not a single person. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The money never surfaced. Not a single $50 note from the heist was ever identified. The gang had either hidden it perfectly or laundered it so carefully that it became untraceable. Police knew exactly who they were looking for: Graham Kinneberg, the monster, and his crew. But knowing and proving were two different things. The gang had left almost no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could identify them. Detectives traced the white Holden panel van. It led nowhere. The gang had probably switched vehicles multiple times before reaching their final destination. But while the physical investigation stalled, the locals of Murwillumbah had questions of their own. Why did it take until 7:30 a.m. to discover the break-in? The robbery took several hours. The gang was probably inside the bank from midnight until at least 4 or 5 a.m. Yet no one noticed anything until the security guard arrived in the morning. How did the criminals know about the money? The $1.7 million shipment had just arrived that day. Information about cash transfers between banks wasn't public knowledge. Only people inside the banking system would know the schedule. Former Tweed Mayor Max Boyd was a counselor at the time of the robbery. He said many in the community believed it was an inside job. Someone must have told the gang that the Murwillumbah branch kept cash supplies from other banks in the area. Why else would they target a country branch? But there was another theory, one that pointed not at the bank, but at the police. In April 2017, the Murwillumbah Historical Society's treasurer, Max Willoughby, revealed something that had never been publicly reported. A senior Sydney policeman had been transferred to Murwillumbah, unusually, without explanation, 5 months before the robbery. 5 months, just long enough to learn the town, learn the rhythms, learn the shift patterns, learn when the streets went quiet. This officer retired from the force in August 1979, less than a year after the heist. His name later appeared in a royal commission. The investigation found he had been deliberately untruthful about his links to a prominent Sydney crime figure, George Freeman. Freeman was one of the most notorious criminals in Sydney. He ran illegal casinos, protected by corrupt police officers. He had connections to organized crime figures across the country. His networks extended from Sydney into Victoria and Queensland, the same Victoria where Graham Kinneberg operated. Freeman was known for paying off police, for having officers on his payroll in every major city, for knowing exactly when raids would happen before they happened. Was there a connection? Did a corrupt police officer help facilitate the heist? Did he ensure that no patrols came near the bank that night? Did he make sure the alarm system wasn't checked? No evidence has ever proven a link, but the questions have never been answered. For decades, police believed Graham Kinneberg was behind the Murwillumbah heist. They watched him, followed him, waited for him to make a mistake. He never did. The monster continued operating in Melbourne's criminal underworld, still avoiding attention, still staying in the shadows. But in the early 2000s, everything changed. Melbourne erupted in what became known as the Gangland Killings, a brutal war between criminal factions that lasted years and left dozens dead. Hitmen, car bombs. The violence was relentless. Old alliances crumbled. Men who had worked together for decades turned on each other over territory, drugs, and money. Kinneberg was connected to the Moran family. Both Mark and Jason Moran were killed during the violence. One by one, the old guard of Melbourne's underworld was being wiped out. And then it was the monster's turn. On December 13th, 2003, Graham Kinneberg went out to buy groceries, a simple errand, something he had done thousands of times. He never made it back. 6 steps from his car, he was shot dead. The master safecracker, who may have orchestrated the biggest heist in Australian history, killed in a suburban street over underworld politics. Whatever secrets he held about Murwillumbah died with him. Was Kinneberg really the one behind it all? Did he take the truth to his grave? But in 2022, a new name emerged. Robert "Birdie" Kidd was a career criminal. He had spent 27 years behind bars. Police described him as dangerous and violent. In January 2022, the Sydney Morning Herald published an article about Kidd's memoirs. In them, he claimed responsibility for some of Australia's most notorious crimes. He took credit for the infamous fine cotton horse racing scandal. He claimed to have smuggled himself inside the luggage hold of a Sydney to Melbourne flight, to steal $2 million from a drug cartel, mid-flight. And he claimed to be the one behind the Murwillumbah bank heist. According to Kidd, it was never about the bank at all. His gang had been following an armored truck up and down the coast for months, watching it, timing it, working out where to hit it. The reason Murwillumbah came into the picture was practical. After all the reconnaissance, he decided the best option was to rob the bank instead of the armored van. His reasoning was simple. Hitting the van could result in guns. Someone could end up dead. They could face armed robbery or murder charges. If they hit the bank, there would be less risk of anyone getting hurt. At worst, they would face break and enter. A calculated decision. The same logic investigators had always suspected. But here's the problem with Birdie Kidd's claim. He wasn't at the heist. On November 23, 1978, Robert Kidd was sitting in a prison cell, serving time for a job he pulled in Maitland at a hotel. He wasn't free. He wasn't on the Gold Coast. He wasn't anywhere near Murwillumbah. But everything he states in his memoirs is public knowledge, information that had been broadcast officially over the years. There's nothing in his account that someone couldn't have pieced together from newspaper clippings and television reports. Could a man really plan a heist this sophisticated from inside a prison cell? Could he coordinate 5 men, specialized equipment, inside information, and a precise timetable while locked behind bars? Did Birdie Kidd really orchestrate the Murwillumbah heist? Or is he just taking credit for someone else's work? The police remain skeptical. Over 45 years have passed since that night in November 1978. The Bank of New South Wales building still stands in Murwillumbah, its heritage listed now, a reminder of a different era. The police station is still 100 meters away. The $250,000 reward has never been claimed. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been convicted. $1.7 million, adjusted for inflation, $10 million in today's money, remains missing. Not a single note has ever been found. Graham Kinneberg is dead. killed in the gangland wars of Melbourne. Bertie Kidd's claims remain unverified. The corrupt police officer, if he existed, has never been identified. And the inside man, whoever tipped off the gang about that cash shipment, has never been named. The Murwillumbah heist remains the biggest unsolved bank robbery in Australian history. Think about what that means. In 45 years, with all the advances in forensic technology, with all the informants and reward money, with all the investigations and cold case reviews, no one has ever been held accountable. Not one person has spent a single day in prison for this crime. The vault door they drilled through is probably still in evidence storage somewhere. The medical scope they left behind has been analyzed dozens of times. The case files fill boxes in police archives across New South Wales. Every few years, a journalist or a cold case detective picks up the file. They go through the same evidence, they ask the same questions, and they reach the same conclusion. Nothing. Some crimes are solved in days, others take years, and some are never solved at all. This is one of those crimes. A perfect plan, a perfect execution, a perfect escape. 5 men walked into a country bank in the dead of night. They cracked a vault that was supposed to be uncrackable. They took $1.7 million that was supposed to be secure, and they vanished into a nation of 15 million people. To this day, no one knows where the money went. No one knows who spent it. No one knows if it's still buried somewhere, waiting to be found. The biggest heist in Australian history, and the criminals got away with it. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.